Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about starting your own company. So let's get into it. So the question in question was from an old friend of mine. So it reads, "Hi Frederick, I am starting. I'm right in the beginning of starting up a new company, and so I wanted to reach out. Uh, I wanted to reach out to see if you have any advice for me. I would really appreciate your input on a few questions that I have related to my new startup. So, first question. Would you say that WordPress is a good alternative to get started with an MVP for a simple website, showing off information, maybe some simple logging, nothing very sophisticated, or is there anything better than WordPress?" Second question, how simple or slash hard do you think it is for a novice like myself to build a MVP in WordPress? Question number three, how scalable would you say that it is with functionality like databases, marketplaces, etc.? We also want to fairly quickly get into more advanced functions built for iOS and Android. Would you recommend trying to find a software co-founder, or should we stick with a consultancy firm? What would you say are pros and cons? Any tips would be appreciated. Thank you. Well, there was a lot of questions here, but let's just walk through. So first and foremost, I basically wrote back to, this is an old friend of mine. I told him that the first thing he's sort of touching on is that, yeah, WordPress is a very good use case for someone who is if you're a novice, you've not done that much coding, WordPress is a very good first stable platform for you to build on, because most of the web hotels out there, or anything that you want to do in terms of hosting, you want to get up your website with a nice domain name and all that stuff. Like for websites like GoDaddy or Amazon or like whatever you might be using, most of these sites they basically have a WordPress set up for you, where you can basically quote unquote now press a button and you have all of that stuff set up for you, because WordPress is actually that popular. So that's a very great first investment. And WordPress is a very beginner friendly community in terms of there's a lot of information. You can follow a lot of tutorials at different levels. It's not all like super high tech stuff, like the sort of stuff that me and my coworkers sort of need to know in order to, because there's a lingo to it, right? When you are like a very senior software developer and you work on really advanced stuff and you watch a tutorial, you already have a lot of pre-training and you already know a lot of stuff related to everything around the thing that they're teaching you, right? But WordPress it's sort of more entry-level stuff. It can be, of course, more sophisticated, but it's very well suited for that stuff, and so you don't have to learn like an entire ocean of other stuff to understand how to use it. And as for simple hard, well, I would say that coding overall for a novice is difficult, but I would say that WordPress is probably on the easier slope for you in comparison to other things, of course, because as I said, there is a lot of information related to it and a lot of guides that you can use in order to get going, so it should be fairly straightforward for you. As for how scalable it is, so this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. I would say that you shouldn't really think about this WordPress site as something that you are going to scale into like a full-fledged project, because that is usually not a great fit for WordPress unless you have a very specific, a very fairly boilerplate standard use case, right? Usually WordPress is much more about information. It's very well suited. You can extend it, of course, but it's very well suited either through like extensions or some type of information display, right? But now we're talking about iOS and Android applications, so in that scenario you want something slightly different, because WordPress is not going to help you with that. If you want a serious database and like iOS and Android development and so forth, there are platforms that you can use. My personal favorite is Firebase, mostly because it's very simple, it's very easy, user friendly, and it has like a database and like OAuth 2 flows for like logging in with Facebook or Google or so forth and so forth. So it also provides you with the necessary tooling to work with iOS and Android. So it's a very well suited platform for those use cases. I would say. I would say overall it's probably at least there might be others because I'm not an expert on that stuff, but it's a very beginner friendly way of starting. So what you're looking for is basically something like that. Don't tie these two products together. Like use WordPress for showing off your product, showing off your company, etc., etc., and then have a secondary system that handles the backend for your Android application or like your iOS application. And as for the co-founder, it really comes down to sort of what business strategy are you going to go with. If you have, say, a long-term idea, like you want to build you're basically creating a product company, right? And your idea is that you're going to develop this thing over some time, and you don't really want to, you don't know exactly how you're going to get to the proof of concept. Then it's usually a good idea for anything. As a rule, if you're doing long-term development, try to get yourself a technical, like a co-founder, someone who is an engineer or something like that, because usually development work takes a lot of time, and consultants can be very pricey especially long term. And so you ideally want, as I like to say, you want to limit the amount of consultancy hours that you need, because you're going to pay quite a lot for them in some cases. I've given a few other tips, like such as like in the beginning, it's usually more efficient for you to try to find someone who is in their start of their careers, where like going to something to like a site where developers basically are posting freelance work opportunities and things like that. That's a very good investment for you as a very young startup if you're just trying to get the ball rolling, because the problem is if you're trying to find that co-founder early on, if you don't know somebody, making that pitch is, in many cases, it can be very difficult for you. So a very viable solution to that problem is to try to look at more junior profiles, because the main thing you're looking for in the beginning is not someone who is super senior. I mean, that's great if you have someone like that, but usually these people are like, it's like winning the lottery if you find someone like that for your, like, fresh idea. But in many cases, you might find more junior profiles who are willing to take on this sort of task to build up their CV or their portfolio or something like that, and you might get away with paying them a little bit less than like someone who's very experienced. But it doesn't really matter if they're like super good or not. The main thing is that they produce the application, because when you get to the proof of concept stage, ideally you should have some way of selling this thing or getting some type of revenue, and you can sort of take it from there. So don't try to get yourself into like a senior portfolio. If you have capital, don't waste all that capital hiring like a super senior consultant for a month, and then they're not done by that month, and then you burn through your entire cash, your entire all your cash. It's better for you to find someone who is less experienced, who can still produce the end results, right? Because if you can get this thing off the ground, in the beginning it's usually a very simple system, and although it might be more like tougher going for a junior profile to get some stuff done, it's still going to be good enough that you can see if this thing's going to hold water, and then you can take the next step and hopefully get some revenue in and actually hire and staff up with more experienced people. And as a bonus, if you do look into freelancers and so forth and you enjoy working with them, the likelihood is that you might find yourself a more junior profile co-founder, or someone who's going to want to work with you long term. You can make those sorts of connections early on, and so you can start there, and then if this thing actually becomes a long-term thing, then you can start looking at trying to find yourself more experienced software developers and so forth. If you're finding it hard to find someone to be a co-founder to start off with. And then the last thing I will mention as well, which is a big thing, if you do go down this route, make sure that you make a very hefty upfront investment in designs and artboards of how things are going to work. Really think it through, because it's cheaper for you as a company, especially when you have limited cash flow, to design everything on paper, like basically use Photoshop or Figma or Sketch or whatever, right, to make the artboard, like design the whole app, design the whole user experience, like the thing that you want to ship, right, so that it's visually easy to understand what this is going to do. If I click this button, what happens? If I go back here, what does happen? And so I really think it through, because if you can actually design basically your entire product on paper. And if you do that, the time you will have to pay for like a consultant, or like that's going to make the job of the developers, that it's going to be so much easier for them, because basically what you've done is that you have made sure that you've minimized the amount of confusion in getting the right requirements, and that's going to help you when it's time to actually do the development work. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you are starting, like my friend here is starting up a new IT company or something like that, the first thing that you should focus on is to keep it simple as humanly possible. Get a web presence, and WordPress is a very good platform for that. There are even simpler ways you could do it, but in terms of you've never done this before, it's probably a very good bet, because it's going to fill your needs for just showing a web page and with like information related to your company or your ID or whatever, and it's going to give you all the resources and like the community, and like there's going to be forums and stuff like that you can get help from. For in many cases, everything from the really professional people to beginners are able to use this platform fairly efficiently, I would say. Then when it comes to like backend development and Android and like iOS development and so forth, don't try to think about these things as the same thing. Start thinking in terms of, okay, there is a platform that I use to just show off my company, which would be WordPress in this scenario, and then I have like the actual app, the application system that I'm working with, and that usually requires a different sort of setup. And if it is an Android or an iOS application, I would recommend Firebase. There are others out there as well, but try to think in those terms. Don't tie these two things together. They are separate applications. And then lastly, when it comes to finding a co-founder or something like that, it's great if you can find someone like that for a long-term project, because development work usually takes longer than people think, and it can be very expensive. A short-term solution can be to get a freelancer or a consultant or something like that, just to get the proof of concept done. If you're going down that route, even if you're getting a co-founder, make sure that you like design your app on paper first, like really make the artboards and think it through, because if you have a very clear understanding of what you need, that's going to turn into less expenses when it comes to hire, if you want to hire somebody, and it's also going to increase like whoever's going to work on it, like their ability to understand what you're going for. And then, as I said, it might be a good idea for you to look at freelancing sites, because a lot of the more junior profiles are looking for these, like that first project that is a little bit more serious, so they can sort of test themselves and build up their CV and so forth. So it might be that you can get away with just hiring someone who is fairly junior, like a college student, or someone who's like trying to get their first serious gig or so forth, at a fraction of the cost it would cost you to hire someone who's like super senior. But at the end of the day, all they're really going to do is that they're going to create the same thing, but most likely for like a fairly high cost. They might be able to do it with higher quality, but in these early days, it's more important that it works than that you have a perfect code base or something like that. Have a great day.